Welcome to today's Explainer. If you're curious about the invisible forces that literally shape the physical bodies of living creatures, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking a really specific, kind of mind-blowing biological phenomenon. As posed in the video title, What Does Convergent Evolution Do in Dwarfism, Homo sapiens sapiens, we're going to look at how the environments around us, rather than just our family trees, totally dictate our physical forms.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll hit the evolutionary misconception, then unforgiving pressures, look at dwarfism across species, funnel right down into dwarfism in Homo sapiens sapiens, and finally, wrap up with evolution versus medical condition. All right, part one, the evolutionary misconception. We really have to start by tearing down a super common myth about how evolution actually operates in the wild. So the absolute key word to focus on here is independently. A lot of the time, we just assume that if two animals look alike, say they both have really small bodies, they must be distant cousins, right? Well, convergent evolution completely flips that script. It's when totally unrelated species, distinct genetic lineages, face the exact same environmental pressures, and to survive, they independently develop similar physical traits. Basically, they arrive at the exact same biological solution completely on their own. No shared recent ancestor required. And here's the thing, convergent evolution isn't some magic wand that just casts a shrink spell on animals. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a process where natural selection just keeps favoring smaller body sizes across totally different species, simply because they happen to be dealing with the same harsh realities. If being tiny gives you an edge in your specific neighborhood, well, several entirely different family trees are going to shrink down over generations just to secure their survival. Moving on to part two. Nature's unforgiving environmental pressures. Let's look at what actually makes shrinking down such a brilliant survival strategy. There are a few main culprits pushing this. First up, resource scarcity, especially on isolated islands. When animals are basically marooned away from the mainland without an all-you-can-eat buffet, there's a massive selective pressure to get smaller, because smaller bodies just need way fewer calories. Then you've got extreme abiotic stresses. We're talking brutal aridity, freezing cold, crazy high winds. For plants stuck up on high mountain peaks, being a dwarf form actually keeps them from getting torn apart by the elements. And finally, think about incredibly dense, narrow vegetation. If your whole world is a super tight, tangled thicket, being big and bulky is a massive liability. Okay, part three. Dwarfism across unrelated species. Let's see how these exact pressures create some absolutely incredible parallels across the entire tree of life. Sometimes getting small isn't even about food or space, it's literally about time. In places where small animals suddenly realize there are no big predators around, convergent evolution kicks off this wild mechanism called pedomorphism. Since they don't need to grow huge to fight off attackers anymore, different animal lineages will just hold on to their juvenile baby-like characteristics right into adulthood. Why? Well, it lets them reach breeding maturity and reproduce way faster. They're basically hacking the system to skip the biological risks of a long, drawn-out growth phase. This brilliantly shows off nature's ultimate workaround across totally different forms of life. Look at this. In harsh mountain and dry environments, a staggering 40 entirely unrelated plant families have converged on microphyly, or dwarf forms, just to survive the brutal weather. Out on remote islands, all sorts of different mammals and miniature primates went through insular dwarfism just to survive on fewer calories. And in really dense shrubs, entirely different species of broadipodian chameleons shrank down just so they could squeeze their narrow branches. Different creatures, totally different locations, exact same biological game plan. There was this fascinating 2026 study on those dwarf chameleons that proved this beautifully. It found that literally, habitat had a stronger influence on their morphology than their evolutionary ancestry. Think about that. Different chameleon lineages independently evolved wildly similar features. We're talking matching tail lengths, hand sizes, foot sizes, even the height of the crests on their heads. They didn't inherit any of this from a shared ancestor. They evolved them completely independently, purely because they lived in similar dense bushes. The environment completely overrode their family trees. Mind-blowing, right? So applying all these ground rules of nature we've just uncovered, we arrive right back at our core question. What does convergent evolution do in dwarfism when we put the magnifying glass over humans? Does our habitat override our ancestry too? Which brings us to section 4, dwarfism in Homo sapiens sapiens. Let's dive right into how these exact same biological rules apply to our own species. Now, scientists are rightfully super careful about throwing around the term convergent evolution when it comes to humans. We really don't use it lightly. They reserve it strictly for groups that have evolved short stature independently for very similar environmental reasons. In biological anthropology, they call this the pygmy phenotype. It's a term describing when totally unrelated human populations independently evolve a relatively short average adult height, not just as a fluke, but as a widespread population-level adaptation. Take a look at populations like Mbuti in Central Africa, the Baka, and the Agda. What's crucial to understand here is that these groups are not closely related to one another. Their ancestries actually diverged tens of thousands of years ago. And yet, if you look at their physical morphology, they all independently evolved a significantly shorter stature. Just like the chameleons and the mountain plants we just talked about, they arrived at the exact same physical solution entirely on their own. But why? What actually drove this? Well, all of these populations made their homes in dense tropical rainforest environments. And honestly, rainforests are incredibly tough. They present entirely unique challenges. You've got limited food to forage, absolutely oppressive heat and humidity, and historically, it's such a demanding environment that it led to a lower life expectancy. So what we're looking at is a breathtaking example of human adaptability, because they all belonged to Homo sapiens but faced the exact same daunting pressures. They needed a smaller body size to survive the heat, live on fewer calories, and reproduce earlier in life. They independently reached this similar body size through completely different genetic changes. Nature is just wild. Finally, let's look at Section 5, Evolution versus Medical Condition. We need to make one absolutely critical distinction here to make sure we have total clarity. The absolute most important difference is this: evolutionary adaptation, like what we see in the Mbuti people, happens at the population level, playing out over many, many generations as a direct survival response to their environment. On the flip side, medical conditions like achondroplasia are caused by a specific genetic mutation in a single individual. It's a medical condition. It is totally unlinked to any sort of environmental adaptation over generations. Understanding that difference between an individual mutation and a multi-generational population adaptation is absolutely vital when we're talking about human biology. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to chew on. Knowing that habitat so powerfully overrides ancestry and seeing how convergent evolution has literally shrunk diverse lineages just to make sure they survive, how might completely unrelated human populations change in the future? Like, if we're forced to adapt to the exact same extreme future climates, what new physical traits might we independently evolve next? It's a pretty wild thought, right? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep asking those big questions, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.